A new survey finds that a majority of youth in Canada believe that the country belongs to Indigenous people.
Academic Frances Widdowson, a co-author of the True North published book Grave Error, and her team were surrounded, shouted down, and allegedly assaulted by a mob of Indigenous activists.
Toronto's dancing mayor Olivia Chow has warned that the feds' failure to fund housing for asylum seekers on the taxpayer dime could lead to a 2% property tax hike for residents. Hello Canada, it's Wednesday, October 1st, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Isaac Lamoureux.
And I'm Walid Tamtam.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. A growing share of young Canadians believe Canada belongs to Indigenous peoples, according to new polling that highlights a widening generational divide over national identity and historical interpretation. The survey, conducted by Leger and first reported by the Canadian Press, found that 58% of Canadians aged 18 to 24 agreed with the statement that, quote, Canada belongs to Indigenous peoples. That figure stands in stark contrast to just 24% among those aged 65 and older. Overall, among all ages, about 1 in 3 Canadians, so 34%, supported the statement, while a majority either disagreed or were unsure. The results come as debates over land acknowledgements, Aboriginal title, and reconciliation continue to shape policy and public discourse across the country. Political commentator Caroline Elliott reacted to the polling results on X, calling the youth sentiment the product of what she described as a long-running campaign in the education system. Elliott wrote, quote, "This is the direct product of an education system that has been relentlessly driving this narrative unchallenged for well over a decade." She warned that, quote, "More than double the number of younger Canadians than older Canadians think true ownership of our country is or should be based on ethnic lines," and added, quote, "We won't fix our country until we fix education." So, Walid, with so many non-Indigenous people in the country and so many immigrants being welcomed into Canada, what is the logical conclusion of this line of thinking so many Canadian youth hold?
Well, it takes you to the narrative of land back, Isaac, and this is what we're seeing happen in British Columbia when it comes to the cases where the government is handing off land, in some cases privately owned, off to Indigenous tribes without democratic consultation, without consultation of the community, and without considering the full scope of effects it has on Canadians. I really think the logical conclusion of this line of thinking, especially what is coming through our generation, is a potential division of Canadians along ethnic lines. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is, especially when you're considering the mass migration Canada has seen, I've seen this so many times at some of these protests and events where people are sticking up for the right of Canada having a controlled immigration system. The counter narrative being, well, your white folks, your Anglo-Saxon Canadians, English Canadians, the European Canadian, what have you, are themselves immigrants, and that's true, factually speaking, in terms of perhaps their descendants generations ago, but generations and progress and contribution to a country is what exactly ties people to a country and what makes them part of that country, in my personal view. So I would say the logical conclusion is one where, let's say that narrative is embraced more in our generation, well, then you'd have a future where the run-of-the-mill migrant will just, pull up to Canada and tell people that, oh, I have a right to be here because, you're also an immigrant yourself. And pretty much everyone except from a shrinking Indigenous population has essentially free will to hop onto the land while, essentially putting everyone on a similar base, a similar boat. Everyone just simply being described as an immigrant, not such thing as a native Canadian or native born Canadian, instead just Indigenous versus immigrant and immigrants running wild. I don't think it's a narrative that really supports social development. I don't think it's a narrative that respects even the history of Indigenous people. Frankly, it's just a narrative to conveniently excuse the mass migration regime this country has been forced to tolerate for far too long. Chaos erupted at the University of Winnipeg last week when a crowd of protesters swarmed academic Frances Widdowson during her, quote, Spectrum Street epistemology session, banging drums, shouting her down, and allegedly assaulting members of her team. One man filming the event was punched, a woman was spat on, and equipment was doused with water in a scene Widdowson later described as a, quote, complete breakdown of civilization. The exercise adapted from philosopher Peter Boghossian's Socratic dialogue method asks participants to stand along a spectrum from strongly agree to strongly disagree in response to prompts designed to spark conversation. On a live stream before the events, Widdowson said, quote, "I'm not afraid," anticipating hostility but insisting the conversations were important. Widdowson was able to carry out her Spectrum Street epistemology exercise at the University of Manitoba on September 25th, with limited opposition. But a day later, at the University of Winnipeg, the situation escalated into open confrontation. Afterwards, a woman appears to have poured water over their equipment and spat on a supporter, while a man was punched in the face. One clip shows someone filming laying on the ground while being surrounded by activists, berating them and shoving phones in their face. One activist tells the person on the ground, quote, "You belong underground."
That's where you belong. That's where you belong. That's where you belong. You belong right there. Right there. Underground. You belong underground. What you did to our kids, our ancestors. What you guys did.
That man, identified as academic Daniel Page, he said he attended to document the event, not to take a position. He told viewers, quote, "I'm here to make sure we're in an academic institution upholding academic freedom." According to Widdowson, police were called but did not arrive. In a live stream, she later compared the chaos to dealing with, quote, "toddlers who are very badly behaved," saying she chose to stand still and not yield. She said, quote, "It was terrible. It was really terrible. We witnessed a breakdown of civilization." So Isaac, U.S. conservative activist Charlie Kirk was assassinated 3 weeks ago today. Many think political violence is just an American issue. Does this incident show that Canadians are also willing to commit political violence against those who disagree with them?
Yeah, Walid. Well, if I were to go through every instance of political violence happening on campuses alone, let's say in Canada, I mean, it's almost an endless list. It would take forever to even list all of the events. But clearly, when we look at incidents like this on campuses, it's clear that political violence is not something that stops at the U.S. border. And we have seen multiple Canadian cases where left-leaning activists have either excused or directly engaged in violence. For example, in Calgary, Black Lives Matter organizer Taylor McNally faced a string of criminal charges since 2020 and was actually convicted in 2023 for assaulting an off-duty police officer during a high school protest, where she also confronted a student over gender identity policies. She was later charged with other offenses, including assault and unlawful confinement, linked to the same demonstration. And True North has highlighted various Canadian academics and activists in the way they've responded to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Instead of condemning it, some have mocked it or even celebrated his killing online. For example, a University of Toronto professor wrote, quote, "Shooting is honestly too good for so many of you fascist expletives." And to give you a hint, that's often the expletive that people deem the worst in the world. But anyways, that shows a willingness to excuse extreme violence when it targets political opponents. That professor, Ruth Marshall, was far from a lone incident. For example, we saw recently Florence Ashley, a law professor at the U of A and a transgender advocate, was similarly temporarily suspended after he compared Kirk to a Nazi. However, he was just recently reinstated. True North has also documented at length similar behavior at pro-Palestinian encampments across Canadian universities. At McGill, Toronto, and Ottawa, demonstrators have openly called for Intifada, an armed uprising, and displayed banners celebrating resistance and even celebrating massacring Israelis. In Montreal, an encampment escalated to vandalism of statues and open clashes with police when officers dismantled the site. And we've seen similar happenings at other cities amid these encampments. But even Canada's intelligence services have been criticized for downplaying these threats. True North, for example, reported that CSIS's annual report zeroed in on right-wing extremism while overlooking the violence and intimidation carried out by left-wing activists in recent years. So all of this underscores that political violence is not uniquely an American problem. From campuses to city streets, Canada has witnessed episodes where activists cross the line from protest into physical intimidation and even assault, often excused by sympathetic voices, and it of course raises the question as to whether authorities and institutions are willing to treat these acts with the seriousness they deserve. But for me, the recurring theme is perhaps that institutions seemingly try to focus on the almost non-existent violence on the right side of the political spectrum while turning a blind eye to the extremism and extreme violence that is recurring on the left. Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow says the federal government's failure to provide sufficient funding for housing asylum seekers could force the city to impose the equivalent of a 2% property tax hike. Chow made the remarks during a press conference on Monday, warning that Ottawa's shortfall in delivering funding is putting pressure on municipal finances. According to the mayor, Toronto is still waiting on roughly $250 million in federal commitments related to refugee housing and social services. Chow said, quote, "If we don't get the funding, the pressure will land on the property tax base of average Torontonians." The comments come amid mounting concerns from critics who say Ottawa's immigration policies have placed an unfair burden on cities without corresponding resources to manage the fallout. Conservative politicians have repeatedly called on the federal government to reduce intake numbers and provide direct compensation to municipalities that are absorbing the costs of temporary housing, shelter space, and local services for asylum seekers. So, Walid, obviously we're looking at Chow talking about a property tax increase here, but how has she done in terms of managing Toronto's budget?
Well, I don't have the economic pedigree to give you a scorecard, but I can tell you what, her budget record is about the same as Pride Toronto's budget record. Shortfall after shortfall after shortfall. Now, if we can remember back to the summer, Pride Toronto had a funding shortfall, which Olivia Chow accounted for using Torontonians' tax dollars to the tune of around $350,000 over the summer to fund that event. And they believe the budget shortfall she's looking at from the winter was somewhere around, back in February, the City of Toronto approved the 2025 budget, which included an operational budget of $18.8 billion and a capital plan of $59.6 billion, which was uniquely supported by a 6.9% property tax increase. Now, speaking of property tax, as you mentioned, that is not including the potential incoming 2% property tax increase just to deal with the massive amount of asylum seekers and the housing that the city is providing them as a result of the federal government pushing that financial burden onto the cities when they ended the federal hotel support program, effectively shifting costs to provinces and in many cases the municipalities, which is the case in Toronto. So I would say prior to this event, you had already seen some tax hikes, significant ones, come from Olivia Chow. Now you yesterday about potential increase of a 2%, so that's somewhere close to 8.9% of property tax increases that the city of Toronto has to face at a time where already the provincial and federal deficit and debt burden is looking like we're going to have to see funding increases from somewhere. And of course, the potential for tax increases always remains. So I think Olivia Chow has done a pretty poor job in assisting Torontonians with overcoming the federal and provincial stress by adding additional stress at the municipal level.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.